I had always considered myself prepared for the wild. A seasoned hiker, I knew the risks and had learned how to stay safe. But nothing in my training or experience had prepared me for what happened that day. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees, when I heard a snap of branches behind me. It was too quiet, too deliberate. The moment I turned around, I saw the outline of the beast, massive, terrifying, and determined. Before I could run, its strength knocked me to the ground, and I was left struggling against claws and teeth. I didn't have a chance to think about escape. All I could focus on was survival. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we dive into today's stories, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to stay updated with future stories. Also, leave a comment letting me know which city in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into the first attack. Jessica Miller squinted through the dusty windshield of her old Ford pickup, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the winding dirt road. The truck's engine grumbled in protest as she navigated around another pothole, her camera equipment jostling in the passenger seat. "Come on, old girl," Jessica muttered, patting the dashboard affectionately. "Just a little further." As the dense Alaskan forest gave way to a small clearing, Jessica let out a sigh of relief. There, bathed in the golden glow of twilight, stood her cabin. It was a modest structure, weathered by years of harsh winters, but to Jessica, it was paradise. She pulled up beside the cabin and cut the engine. For a moment she sat in silence, drinking in the quiet. The only sounds were the ticking of the cooling engine and the whisper of wind through the pines. It was a stark contrast to the bustle of Anchorage, where she'd spent the last month chasing freelance gigs. "Home sweet home," Jessica said to herself, a small smile playing on her lips. As she stepped out of the truck, a cool breeze ruffled her hair, carrying with it the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. Jessica stretched, working out the kinks from the long drive. Her gaze swept across the clearing, taking in the familiar sights. The stack of firewood by the porch, the rusted axe leaning against a nearby stump, and Jessica froze. Something was different. Her eyes locked onto the area near her. Trash bins. The ground there was disturbed, the soft earth gouged by what looked like paw prints. Large paw prints. "No way." Jessica breathed, her heart rate quickening. She approached cautiously, crouching down to examine the tracks more closely. They were unmistakable, the telltale sign of a bear, and a big one at that. A twig snapped in the forest behind her, and Jessica whirled around, her pulse pounding in her ears. The trees stood silent and still, betraying nothing of what might lurk in their shadows. She scanned the tree line, straining her eyes for any sign of movement, but saw nothing. "Get a grip, Jess," she chided herself, trying to calm her nerves. "Bears were here long before you. This is their home too." Still, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of her stomach as she turned back to her truck. She began unloading her gear with renewed urgency, keeping one eye on the surrounding forest as she worked. As Jessica carried the last of her equipment inside, the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the clearing into twilight. She locked the door behind her, the familiar scent of wood and old leather greeting her as she flicked on the lights. The cabin was just as she'd left it, a cozy, if cluttered, one-room haven. Her bed occupied one corner, a small kitchenette and dining table another. The walls were adorned with her favorite photographs, snapshots of Alaska's wild beauty. Jessica busied herself with unpacking, trying to shake off the unease that had followed her inside. She put away her clothes, stowed her camera gear, and started a pot of coffee. The routine helped calm her nerves, and soon the rich aroma of brewing coffee filled the cabin. As the coffee percolated, Jessica's stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since breakfast. She rummaged through her supplies, pulling out a can of soup and some crackers. It wasn't gourmet, but it would do for tonight. While her soup heated on the small stove, Jessica's gaze drifted to the window. The forest outside was now cloaked in darkness, the trees nothing more than looming silhouettes against the night sky. She shivered, suddenly feeling very small and alone. "Stop it," she said aloud, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. "You've stayed here 100 times before. Nothing's changed." But as she spooned soup into her mouth, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The paw prints by the trash bins flashed in her mind. How recent were they? And more importantly, would their owner be back? After dinner, Jessica tried to distract herself by reviewing the photos from her last assignment. She curled up on her bed with her laptop, losing herself in images of Anchorage's city lights and bustling streets. But every few minutes, her eyes would dart to the window, searching the darkness beyond. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to overtake Jessica's unease. She changed into her pajamas and brushed her teeth, the mundane routine helping to settle her nerves. But as she climbed into bed and switched off the light, the cabin seemed to come alive with unfamiliar noises. The old structure creaked and settled, each sound amplified in the silence of the night. The wind picked up outside, whistling through the trees and rattling a loose shutter. Jessica pulled the blankets up to her chin, her eyes wide open in the darkness. "It's just the wind," she whispered to herself. Just the wind and an old cabin, nothing more. But in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered of massive paw prints and gleaming claws. Jessica squeezed her eyes shut, willing sleep to come. She focused on her breathing, trying to slow her racing heart. In, out, in, out. Gradually, the tension began to leave her body. The sounds of the forest faded into a soothing backdrop as Jessica drifted towards sleep. Her last conscious thought was of the photos she planned to take tomorrow, of sunlight filtering through autumn leaves and mist rising off the nearby lake. She was on the edge of sleep when it happened. A deafening crash shattered the night's silence. The sound of splintering wood and shattering glass filled the cabin. Jessica bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. For a split second, she sat frozen in the darkness, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Then she heard it, heavy, lumbering footsteps and the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against wood. "Oh God," Jessica breathed, her voice barely audible over the blood rushing in her ears. Something was in the cabin, something big. The realization hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs. Jessica's hand fumbled for the bedside lamp, her fingers trembling so badly she could barely grip the switch. Light flooded the room, momentarily blinding her. As her eyes adjusted, Jessica's gaze locked onto the bedroom doorway. There, filling the entire frame, was a sight that would haunt her for years to come. A massive grizzly bear stood on its hind legs, its fur matted and its eyes gleaming in the sudden light. It let out a low, rumbling growl that Jessica felt in her bones. Time seemed to stand still as human and bear stared at each other. In that moment, Jessica knew with terrifying certainty that her life would never be the same. The quiet night that had unnerved her earlier now seemed like a distant dream. The true nightmare was just beginning. Jessica's world narrowed to a single point, the enormous grizzly bear filling her bedroom doorway. Her breath came in short, rapid gasps as her mind struggled to process the impossible scene before her. The bear's massive head swung from side to side, its nostrils flaring as it took in the scents of the cabin. Its eyes, small and dark, glinted with an intelligence that sent chills down Jessica's spine. This wasn't just a dumb animal. It was an apex predator, perfectly evolved to hunt and kill. For what felt like an eternity, neither Jessica nor the bear moved. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the grizzly, punctuated by the occasional low growl that resonated through the small cabin. Jessica's thoughts raced. How had it gotten in? The crash. It must have broken through a window or door downstairs. Why was it here? Food. It had to be food. The trash bins outside. As if reading her thoughts, the bear dropped to all fours with a thud that shook the floor. It began to move into the room, its claws scraping against the wooden floorboards. With each step, "No, no, no," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. She pressed herself against the headboard, trying to make herself as small as possible. Her eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for an escape route or weapon, but found none. The bear paused, its head tilting slightly at the sound of her voice. For a brief moment, hope flared in Jessica's chest. Maybe it would be startled by her presence and leave. That hope was quickly extinguished as the bear let out a deep, rumbling roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. Jessica felt the sound in her chest, a primal fear taking hold of her entire being. "Please," she whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "Please go away." But the bear didn't go away. It took another step forward, its enormous bulk now fully in the bedroom. Jessica could smell its musky, wild scent, a mix of wet fur, earth, and something uniquely predatory. Time seemed to slow down as the bear's eyes locked onto hers. In that moment, Jessica saw her own reflection in those dark orbs, a terrified, helpless prey animal cornered by a force of nature. The bear's muscles tensed, and Jessica knew with horrifying certainty what was about to happen. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. In a blur of motion almost too fast for Jessica to comprehend, the grizzly lunged forward. Its massive paw, armed with claws as long as Jessica's fingers, swiped through the air. Pain exploded through Jessica's body as the bear's claws tore into her left shoulder. The force of the blow knocked her sideways, off the bed and onto the hard floor. She hit the ground with a thud, her vision blurring from the impact and the searing agony radiating from her shoulder. "Help!" Jessica finally managed to scream, her voice raw and desperate. "Somebody help me!" But there was no one to hear her cries. No neighbors for miles, no passing cars, no park rangers on patrol. She was alone with the bear. Warm blood soaked through her pajama top, spreading across the wooden floor beneath her. The metallic scent filled the air, mixing with the bear's musky odor. Jessica's mind raced, adrenaline surging through her veins. She had to move, had to get away. But where? The bear was between her and the door, and the windows were too small to escape through quickly. The grizzly let out another roar, softer this time but no less terrifying. It took a lumbering step towards her, its massive paws leaving bloody prints on the floor. With a surge of desperate energy, Jessica scrambled backwards, ignoring the screaming pain in her shoulder. Her back hit the wall, and she used it to push herself to her feet. The bear watched her, its head swaying from side to side. It seemed almost curious, as if it couldn't quite figure out what to make of this strange, bleeding creature. Jessica's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. Her gaze fell on the bedside lamp, still illuminating the surreal scene. Moving slowly, trying not to provoke the bear, Jessica inched her way along the wall towards the lamp. The grizzly tracked her movement, letting out a low growl. "It's okay," Jessica said, her voice shaking. "It's okay. You don't want to be. Here, there's no food, just go back outside." The bear's only response was another growl, deeper this time. It took another step forward, its massive bulk seeming to fill the entire room. Jessica's hand closed around the base of the lamp. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She lifted it, the cord trailing behind, and held it in front of her like a shield. "Stay back," she said, trying to inject some strength into her voice. "I'm warning you." The grizzly reared up on its hind legs, towering over Jessica. Its front paws, each larger than Jessica's head, swiped at the air. Another roar filled the cabin, so loud it made Jessica's ears ring. In that moment, something snapped inside Jessica. Fear gave way to a primal survival instinct. With a scream that matched the bear's roar in intensity, she swung the lamp with all her might. The lamp connected with the bear's snout with a solid thwack. The grizzly's head jerked back, more from surprise than pain. It let out a yelp that sounded almost comically dog-like coming from such a massive creature. Jessica didn't wait to see the bear's reaction. She bolted for the door, her feet slipping in her own blood on the floor. Behind her, she could hear the bear thrashing, its huge body slamming against the walls and furniture. She hit the stairs, at a run, nearly falling headlong down them in her haste. The bear's angry growls filled the cabin, spurring her on despite the pain and dizziness threatening to overwhelm her. At the bottom of the stairs, Jessica's foot caught on a piece of broken furniture, remnants of the bear's entrance. She stumbled, catching herself on the wall. Her injured shoulder screamed in protest, and for a moment black spots danced in her vision. "No," she gasped, forcing herself to stay conscious. "No, I have to get out." The front door was just a few feet away, hanging off its hinges. Beyond it, Jessica could see the dark forest, terrifying in its own right, but infinitely preferable to the creature behind her. Heavy footsteps on the stairs told her the bear was following. Jessica lunged for the door, her fingers fumbling with the lock that still, miraculously, held. Come on, come on, she muttered, her bloody fingers slipping on the metal. With a final click, the lock gave way. Jessica yanked the door open and burst out into the cool night air. She didn't look back, didn't pause to see if the bear was still following. She just ran, her bare feet pounding against the forest floor, branches whipping at her face. Behind her, the bear's roars echoed through the night, growing fainter as Jessica plunged deeper into the dark forest. But even as the sounds faded, Jessica knew the nightmare was far from over. She was injured, alone, and lost in the wilderness, with a predator that knew her scent. The night closed in around her as Jessica ran, her only thought to put as much distance between herself and the cabin as possible. The true horror of her situation was just beginning to unfold. Adrenaline surged through Jessica's veins. As she bolted down the stairs, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the bear's furious roars behind her. The pain in her shoulder was a distant throb, overwhelmed by the primal need to escape. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, Jessica's mind raced. She needed a weapon, something to defend herself if the bear caught up to her. Her eyes darted around the dimly lit living room, searching desperately for anything she could use. Come on, she muttered, her voice trembling. There has to be something. The bear's heavy footsteps on the stairs spurred her into action. Jessica lunged towards the fireplace, her hand closing around the iron poker leaning against the hearth. It was heavy and awkward, but it was better than nothing. Just as her fingers gripped the cool metal, a deafening roar filled the room. Jessica spun around, the poker held out in front of her like a sword. The grizzly bear stood at the bottom of the stairs, its massive form blocking any escape route back to the bedroom. Its small eyes gleamed with predatory focus, locked onto Jessica's trembling form. Blood matted the fur around its snout where the lamp had struck it, adding to its terrifying appearance. "Stay back," Jessica yelled, her voice cracking with fear. She waved the poker in front of her, trying to appear larger and more threatening. "Get out of here." The bear seemed unfazed by her display. It dropped to all fours, its claws scraping against the wooden floor as it took a step towards her. Jessica could feel its hot breath from across the room, carrying the scent of raw meat and wild forests. Time seemed to slow down as Jessica's survival instincts kicked into overdrive. She knew she couldn't outrun the bear, and she certainly couldn't overpower it. Her only hope was to somehow get past it and out of the cabin. The bear lunged forward with surprising speed for such a large animal. Jessica barely had time to react, swinging the poker wildly. By sheer luck, the iron rod connected with the bear's shoulder, causing it to let out a surprised yelp. The blow bought Jessica a precious few seconds. She darted to the side, trying to circle around the bear towards the front door, but the grizzly was quicker than she anticipated. It swung its massive head, catching Jessica in the side and sending her flying across the room. She slammed into the dining table, the air driven from her lungs. The poker clattered to the floor, sliding out of reach. Jessica gasped for breath, pain blossoming across her ribs where the bear had struck her. No, she wheezed, struggling to her feet. Her eyes locked onto the poker, now lying just a few feet from the bear. The grizzly shook its head, as if clearing it after the blow from the poker. Its eyes found Jessica again, and a low growl rumbled through its chest. It took a step towards her, then another, its massive paws leaving bloody prints on the floor. Jessica backed away, her hands held out in front of her. "Easy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Easy now. You don't want to do this." Her back hit the wall, and Jessica realized with horror that she had nowhere left to go. The bear was between her and every possible exit. She was trapped. The grizzly rose up on its hind legs, towering over Jessica. Its hot breath washed over her face as it let out another ear-splitting roar. Jessica could see every detail of its terrible maw. The yellowed teeth, each as long as her finger, the pink tongue, the flaring nostrils. In that moment, looking death in the face, something snapped inside Jessica. A surge of desperate strength flooded her body. She wasn't going to die here, not like this. With a scream that matched the bear's roar in intensity, Jessica ducked under the grizzly's raised paw. She rolled across the floor, ignoring the pain that flared in her shoulder and ribs. Her hand closed around the handle of the poker and she came up swinging, The iron rod connected with the bear's snout with a sickening crack. The grizzly reared back, shaking its head in pain and surprise. Blood sprayed from its nose, splattering across the walls and floor. Jessica didn't wait to see if the blow had any lasting effect. She scrambled to her feet and made a dash for the front door. Behind her, she could hear the bear's angry roars and the sound of furniture being smashed as it thrashed about in pain and fury. Her fingers fumbled with the door lock, slick with sweat and blood. Come on," she muttered, her voice rising in panic as she heard the bear's heavy footsteps approaching. Finally, the lock gave way. Jessica yanked the door open and burst out into the cool night air. The forest loomed before her, dark and foreboding, but infinitely preferable to the raging predator behind her. She ran, her bare feet pounding against the forest floor. Branches whipped at her face and snagged her clothes, but Jessica barely noticed. All she could focus on was the need to put as much distance between herself and the bear as possible. Behind her, she could hear the bear's roars echoing through the trees. Whether it was following her or still in the cabin, she couldn't tell. She didn't dare look back to check. Jessica's lungs burned as she pushed herself harder, running blindly through the dark forest. Every shadow seemed to hide another predator, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. But she kept running, driven by pure survival instinct. Time lost all meaning as Jessica fled through the woods. It could have been minutes or hours, she had no way to tell. Her body was operating on pure adrenaline, pushing past the pain and exhaustion. Eventually, her foot caught on an exposed root, sending her sprawling to the forest floor. Jessica rolled with the fall, coming to rest against the trunk of a massive pine tree. For a moment, she lay there, gasping for breath, her entire body trembling with exertion and fear. As the immediate panic began to subside, the reality of her situation started to sink in. She was alone in the Alaskan wilderness, injured and unarmed, with a potentially angry bear somewhere behind her. The night was cold, and Jessica was dressed, only in her blood-soaked pajamas. "Think, Jess, think," she muttered to herself, trying to calm her racing thoughts. What's the first priority? Survival training from her years of wilderness photography kicked in. First, she needed to assess her injuries. The bear's claws had left deep gashes in her left shoulder, and her side ached where it had struck her. In the cabin, but nothing seemed to be broken and the bleeding from her shoulder had slowed to a trickle. Next, she needed to find shelter. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and in her current state, hypothermia was a real danger. But the thought of trying to find her way back to the cabin filled her with dread. Jessica forced herself to her feet, using the tree for support. She scanned the darkness around her, straining her eyes for any sign of shelter or landmark. But all she could see were endless trees, their shadows seeming to shift and move in the faint moonlight. A twig snapped somewhere in the forest behind her, and Jessica froze. Was it the bear? Had it followed her? Or was it some other predator drawn by the scent of her blood? Her heart pounding, Jessica began to move again, this time more slowly and quietly. She had no idea which direction she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay in one place. She had to find help, or at least a safe place to wait out the night. As she limped through the forest, Jessica's mind raced with questions. How far had she run? How would she find her way back? And most pressingly, was the bear still out there, hunting her? The forest seemed to close in around her, every sound amplified in the quiet night. Jessica's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she pushed on, driven by the need to survive and the terrifying memory of those gleaming predator eyes. The struggle was far from over. In fact, Jessica realized with a sinking feeling it might have only just begun. Jessica's heart pounded in her ears as she stumbled through the dark forest. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every rustle of leaves a potential predator. The adrenaline that had fueled her initial flight from the cabin was beginning to wane, leaving her acutely aware of the pain in her shoulder and the chill seeping into her bones. She paused, leaning against a tree to catch her breath. The night was eerily quiet, broken only by the sound of her ragged breathing. Jessica strained her ears, listening for any sign of pursuit. Had the bear followed her? Or was it still back at the cabin? "Get it together, Jess," she muttered to herself, trying to slow her racing thoughts. "You need a plan." Her years of Wilderness experience as a photographer began to assert themselves. First priority, find shelter. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and in her blood-stained pajamas, hypothermia was a real danger. Jessica scanned the darkness around her, searching for anything that might offer protection from the elements. Her eyes, now adjusted to the dim light, picked out the silhouette of a large fallen tree about 50 yards away. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She began to move towards it, her bare feet carefully navigating the forest floor. Every step sent jolts of pain through her injured shoulder, but Jessica gritted her teeth and pressed on. As she neared the fallen tree, a twig snapped somewhere behind her. Jessica froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned slowly, eyes wide as she peered into the darkness. Nothing moved. The forest was still. "It's nothing," Jessica whispered, trying to convince herself. "Just an animal. A small one." But she couldn't shake the image of the bear's gleaming eyes, the memory of its hot breath on her face. Jessica quickened her pace, almost running the last few yards to the fallen tree. The massive trunk was nearly as tall as she was, creating a small sheltered space beneath it. Jessica dropped to her knees and crawled into the gap, ignoring the protests of her battered body. Once inside, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The enclosed space offered a small sense of security, though Jessica knew it was largely illusory. If the bear found her here, the fallen tree would offer little protection. "Okay, think," Jessica said aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "What's next?" She needed to take stock of her situation. Jessica ran her hands over her body, assessing her injuries. The gashes on her shoulder were deep, but the bleeding had slowed to a trickle. Her ribs ached where the bear had struck her, but she didn't think anything was broken. Various cuts and scrapes stung across her arms and legs, souvenirs from her headlong flight through the forest. "Could be worse," she muttered grimly. "At least I'm still breathing." The next priority was warmth. Jessica's thin pajamas were poor protection against the Alaskan night, and she could feel herself starting to shiver. She began to gather leaves and pine needles, piling them around herself for insulation. It wasn't much, but it helped a little. As she worked, Jessica's mind raced, trying to form a plan. She had no idea how far she'd run or in what direction. The cabin was her only real hope for survival, but the thought of returning there, of potentially facing the bear again, made her stomach churn with fear. "Focus on what you can control," Jessica told herself, falling back on the mantras she'd learned in wilderness survival courses. One step at a time. She knew she couldn't stay here indefinitely. Come daylight, she'd need to try to find her, way back to the cabin or to a road. But for now, all she could do was wait out the night and hope the bear didn't find her. Hours crawled by. Every sound made Jessica tense, her imagination conjuring images of the bear crashing through the underbrush towards her. But gradually, exhaustion began to override fear. Jessica's eyelids grew heavy, her body demanding rest to heal. She fought against sleep, afraid of what might happen if she let her guard down. But in the end, her battered body won out. Jessica drifted into a fitful slumber, her dreams filled with gleaming teeth and razor-sharp claws. A loud crack jolted Jessica awake. She sat up quickly, banging her head on the fallen tree above her. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure of where she was or what had happened. Then the memories came flooding back. The bear, the attack, her desperate flight through the forest. Jessica held her breath, listening intently. The pre-dawn forest was quiet, the first hints of light just beginning to filter through the trees. Had she imagined the sound? Then she heard it again. A definite snap of a branch, too loud to be a small animal, and it was close. Jessica's heart began to race. She peered out from her shelter, straining her eyes in the dim light. At first she saw nothing. Then, a movement caught her eye. A massive shape moved between the trees about 30 yards away. Even in the low light, there was no mistaking it. The bear had found her. "No, no, no," Jessica whispered, panic rising in her chest. She pressed herself back against the fallen tree, trying to make herself as small as possible. The bear paused, its head swinging from side to side as it scented the air. Jessica knew her blood trail must have led it straight to her. She watched, barely breathing, as the grizzly took a step in her direction. In that moment, Jessica knew she had to move. The fallen tree might hide her from sight, but it would offer no real protection if the bear decided to investigate. Her only chance was to run and hope she could find better shelter or help. Taking a deep breath, Jessica tensed her muscles, preparing to bolt. She'd have one chance at this. If the bear saw her, she pushed the thought from her mind. She couldn't afford to think about failure now. The grizzly took another step towards her hiding place. It was now or never. Jessica burst from her shelter, sprinting away from the bear as fast as her battered body would allow. Behind her, she heard a startled grunt, followed by the sound of heavy footfalls. The bear was in pursuit. Branches whipped at Jessica's face. As she ran, her bare feet pounding against the forest floor. She could hear the bear crashing through the underbrush behind her, gaining ground with every step. "Help!" Jessica screamed, though she knew there was no one to hear her. "Somebody help me!" Her lungs burned, her legs trembled with exhaustion. Jessica knew she couldn't outrun the bear for long. She needed a plan. Fast. Ahead, the trees began to thin. Jessica caught a glimpse of open space beyond. A clearing, or, as she burst out of the tree line, Jessica's heart leapt. There, not 50 yards away, was a paved road, and in the distance she could see headlights approaching. "Hey!" Jessica yelled, waving her arms frantically. "Over here! Help!" She risked a glance behind her. The bear had paused at the edge of the forest, seemingly wary of the open space and the approaching vehicle, but Jessica knew its hesitation wouldn't last long. The headlights drew closer. It was a truck, moving at a good clip down the empty road. Jessica ran towards it, ignoring the pain that flared with every step. "Stop! Please stop!" she screamed. The truck's brakes squealed as the driver finally spotted her. Jessica could have cried with relief as the vehicle pulled to a stop beside her. An older man leaned out of the driver's side window, his eyes wide with shock. "Good Lord, miss, what happened to you?" "Bear," Jessica gasped, yanking open the passenger door and climbing in. "There's a bear. Please, we need to go. Now." The driver didn't need to be told twice. He stomped on the accelerator, the truck's tires spinning on the asphalt before finding purchase. As they sped away, Jessica looked in the side mirror. The bear had emerged from the forest and was standing in the middle of the road, watching the truck disappear into the distance. Jessica slumped in her seat, the adrenaline draining from her body. She was alive. She had escaped. But as the reality of what had happened began to sink in, Jessica knew that the ordeal was far from over. The memory of those terrifying hours would stay with her for a long, long time. As the truck sped down the road, Jessica's adrenaline began to ebb, leaving her acutely aware of her injuries and the bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. The older man driving the truck kept glancing at her with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Miss, we need to get you to a hospital," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "You're bleeding pretty bad there." Jessica nodded weakly, her hand instinctively going to her injured shoulder. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice hoarse from screaming. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." The man introduced himself as Frank, a local who worked early shifts at a nearby lumber mill. As they drove, Jessica gave him a brief account of what had happened, her voice shaking as she relived the terrifying encounter. Frank shook his head, in amazement. "Been living in these parts for 40 years and I've never heard of a bear breaking into someone's home like that." "You're lucky to be alive, miss." As they neared the town, Frank radioed ahead to the local clinic to let them know they were coming. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon when they pulled up to the small medical facility. The next few hours passed in a blur for Jessica. Doctors cleaned and stitched her wounds, administered antibiotics, and checked her for internal injuries. The police came to take her statement, their faces grim as she recounted her harrowing experience. It was mid-morning by the time Jessica was finally left alone in a quiet hospital room. The doctors wanted to keep her for observation, concerned about the risk of infection from the bear's claws. As she lay in the sterile bed, the events of the night replayed in her mind on an endless loop. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the bear's massive form filling her bedroom doorway. She could still smell its musky odor, still feel the searing pain as its claws tore into her flesh. Jessica shuddered, pulling the thin hospital blanket tighter around herself. A nurse came in to check on her, offering a gentle smile. "How are you feeling, Ms. Miller?" Jessica tried to return the smile, but it felt more like a grimace. "I'm okay, just processing, I guess." The nurse nodded sympathetically. "That's understandable. You've been through a traumatic experience. Would you like me to call anyone for you? Family or friends?" Jessica shook her head. Her parents were on a cruise in the Caribbean, unreachable for another week. And as a freelance photographer who spent most of her time in the wilderness, she didn't have many close friends nearby. "No, thank you," she said quietly. "I'll be all right." As the nurse left, Jessica turned her gaze to the window. The day outside was bright and clear, a stark contrast to the darkness of the previous night. But even in the light of day, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that clung to her. Hours passed slowly. Jessica drifted in and out of a restless sleep, each time jerking awake at the slightest sound, her heart racing. During her waking moments, she tried to distract herself by planning her next steps. She would need to contact her insurance company, arrange for repairs to her cabin, replace her damaged equipment. But underneath the practical considerations, a deeper worry gnawed at her. How could she ever feel safe in her beloved wilderness again? The forest that had once been her sanctuary now seemed filled with hidden dangers. As evening approached, a park ranger came to visit her. Ranger Mike Thompson was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a kind face lined by years in the outdoors. "Ms. Miller," he greeted her, taking a seat beside her bed. "How are you holding up?" Jessica managed a weak smile. "I've been better, but I'm alive, which is more than I expected last night." Ranger Mike nodded solemnly. "You're one tough lady, that's for sure. Not many people could have survived what you did." He paused, his expression turning serious. "I wanted to talk to you about the bear. We've sent a team out to your cabin to assess the situation." Jessica felt her heart rate quicken. Did they find it?" "No sign of the bear at your cabin," Mike replied. "But we found plenty of evidence corroborating your story. That grizzly did quite a number on your place." A mix of relief and anxiety washed over Jessica. On one hand, she was glad the bear wasn't still lurking around her cabin. On the other, the thought that it was still out there somewhere, perhaps waiting to attack someone else, filled her with dread. "What happens now?" she asked. Ranger Mike leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "We've issued a warning to locals and set up some traps in the area. But I'll be honest with you, Ms. Miller, the chances of catching this specific bear are slim. Grizzlies can roam over huge territories." Jessica nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "I understand." "I know this is difficult," Mike continued, "but I need to ask. Did you have any food or strong-smelling items in or around your cabin? Anything that might have attracted the bear?" Jessica thought back, trying to remember through the haze of fear and pain. I had just gotten back from a trip. My trash bins outside. They probably had some food waste in them, and I think I left some snacks out on the counter inside." She felt a wave of guilt wash over her. "I should have known better. I've worked in these woods for years. I know the precautions." Ranger Mike held up a hand, cutting off her self-recrimination. "Ms. Miller, this wasn't your fault. Yes, we always advise people to be careful with food in bear country. But what happened to you was an extreme and rare event. This bear's behavior was unusually aggressive." His words were meant to be comforting, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow brought this on herself. If she had been more careful, more vigilant. As if reading her thoughts, Ranger Mike leaned in, his voice firm. "Listen to me, Jessica. You survived. That's what matters. And your experience, as terrible as it was, might help prevent something similar from happening to someone else." Jessica met his gaze, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. She took a deep breath, trying to let his words sink in. "Thank you, Ranger Mike. I'll try to remember that." As the ranger stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Get some rest, Ms. Miller. And when you're ready, don't be afraid to reach out if you need to talk. Surviving something like this, it can leave scars that aren't visible. There's no shame in seeking help." After he left, Jessica turned her gaze back to the window. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. In the distance, she could see the dark line of the forest against the horizon. Once that sight had filled her with excitement and wonder. Now it sent a shiver down her spine. As darkness began to fall, Jessica found herself tensing, the memories of the previous night pressing in around her. She knew that the long wait for morning was just beginning, and with it, the struggle to reclaim her sense of safety in the wilderness she had always called home. As she settled in for a long, uneasy night, Jessica wondered if she would ever be able to look at those forests the same way again. 3 days after the attack, Jessica stood at the threshold of her cabin, her hand trembling as it hovered over the doorknob. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch, highlighting the deep gouges in the wood. A stark reminder of that terrifying night. "You can do this, Jess," she muttered to herself, taking a deep breath. With a surge of determination, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The sight that greeted her made her stomach lurch. Overturned furniture lay scattered across the floor, shards of glass glittering in the sunlight streaming through the broken window. Dark stains marred the wooden floorboards. Her blood, she realized with a shudder. Jessica moved slowly through the cabin, cataloging the destruction. The bear had wreaked havoc in its search for food, leaving no corner untouched. Her camera equipment, once neatly organized on a shelf, lay in pieces on the floor. Claw marks scored the walls, a chilling testament to the bear's strength and size. As she reached the stairs leading to her bedroom, Jessica paused. Her heart rate quickened as memories of that night flooded back, the bear's massive form filling the doorway, its hot breath on her face, the searing pain as its claws tore into her flesh. "It's not here," she reminded herself firmly. "You're safe now." Steeling herself, Jessica climbed the stairs. The bedroom was in even worse shape than the living area. Her bed was overturned, the mattress shredded. Clothes from her closet were strewn about, many torn beyond repair. And there, on the floor near the window, lay the broken remains of the lamp she had used to strike the bear. Jessica felt her legs grow weak. She sank to the floor, her back against the wall, and buried her face in her hands. The full weight of what had happened, what she had survived, crashed over her like a wave. A sob escaped her throat, then another. Soon Jessica was crying uncontrollably, her body shaking with the force of her emotions. All the fear, pain, and shock she had been holding at bay in the hospital came pouring out. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, letting the tears flow. Eventually, the sobs subsided, leaving her feeling drained but somehow lighter. Jessica wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. "Okay," she said aloud, her voice hoarse. "Time to get to work." Over the next few hours, Jessica began the arduous task of cleaning up. She started in the living room, sweeping up broken glass and righting furniture. As she worked, she made mental notes of what needed to be repaired or replaced. The physical labor helped keep her mind focused, preventing it from wandering back to that terrifying night. But every now and then, a sudden sound from outside or an unexpected shadow would make her freeze, her heart racing as she instinctively scanned for danger. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow through the broken window, Jessica decided it was time to call it a day. She had made progress, but the cabin was far from habitable. She would need to stay in town for at least a few more nights. Just as she was preparing to leave, her phone rang. The caller ID showed it was her friend, Sarah, a fellow photographer she had worked with on several projects. "Hey, Jess," Sarah's voice came through, tinged with worry. "I just heard what happened. Are you okay?" Jessica sank onto the couch, suddenly feeling exhausted. I'm alive," she replied, not quite sure how else to describe her state. "God, Jess, I can't even imagine. Do you need anything? I can be there in a few hours if you want company." Jessica felt a rush of gratitude for her friend's offer. "Thanks, Sarah, I appreciate it, but I think I need to do this on my own for now. I'm just trying to process everything, you know?" "I understand," Sarah said softly. "Just remember, you don't have to go through this alone. When you're ready to talk, I'm here." After hanging up, Jessica sat in the growing darkness, Sarah's words echoing in her mind. She had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to handle whatever the wilderness threw at her. But this was different. With a sigh, Jessica stood and made her way to the door. As she stepped onto the porch, she paused, looking out at the forest beyond. The trees stood silent in the twilight, their familiar silhouettes now seeming ominous and foreboding. Back in her rental car, Jessica pulled out her phone again. Her finger hovered over the contact for Dr. Emily Chen, the therapist the hospital had recommended. She had initially brushed off the suggestion, convinced she could handle the aftermath on her own. Now, though, before she could second-guess herself, Jessica pressed the call button. Dr. Chen's office, a friendly voice answered. "Hi," Jessica said, her voice wavering slightly. "My name is Jessica Miller. I think I need to make an appointment." The next morning, Jessica returned to the cabin early, determined to make more progress. As she pulled up, she was surprised to see a police car parked in front of the house. Officer Mark Ramirez, who had taken her initial statement at the hospital, was examining the claw marks on the porch. "Ms. Miller," he greeted her as she approached. "I hope you don't mind. We wanted to do a follow-up investigation in daylight." Jessica nodded, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened at the sight of the damage. "Of course, please. Let me know if you need anything." As Officer Ramirez continued his examination, Jessica resumed her cleaning efforts inside. She was in the kitchen, scrubbing at a particularly stubborn stain, when the officer called out to her. "Ms. Miller, could you come here for a moment?" Jessica joined him on the porch, where he was crouched near the steps, examining something on the ground. "I know this might be difficult," Officer Ramirez said gently, "but could you tell me again exactly what happened when you first encountered the bear?" Jessica closed her eyes, taking a deep breath as she forced herself to revisit that moment. I was in bed. There was a crash downstairs. That must have been when it broke through the window. Then I heard it coming up the stairs. It appeared in my bedroom doorway, and then she trailed off, her hand unconsciously going to her injured shoulder. Officer Ramirez nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Miller, based on the evidence we've gathered, including these prints here," he gestured to some indentations in the soft earth near the porch, "it appears that this bear had been scoping out your cabin for some time before the attack." Jessica felt her blood run cold. "What do you mean? These prints are at least a few days old. It seems the bear had been coming around, likely attracted by food smells. The night of the attack, it finally worked up the courage to break in." The implications of his words hit Jessica like a physical blow. The bear hadn't just randomly stumbled upon her cabin. It had been watching, waiting. The forest she had always seen as a peaceful refuge suddenly seemed full of hidden threats. I didn't know," she stammered, feeling lightheaded. "I should have been more careful with my trash. I should have noticed signs." Officer Ramirez stood, placing a comforting hand on her uninjured shoulder. "Ms. Miller, this wasn't your fault. Bears are opportunistic, and this one saw an opportunity. You survived a situation that many wouldn't have. That's what matters." As the officer prepared to leave, he paused. "One more thing, Ms. Miller. We'll file a full report, but given the circumstances, it's unlikely there will be any further official action. These things, they're part of the risk of living out here." Jessica nodded numbly, watching as he drove away. She turned back to face her cabin, seeing it with new eyes. The place that had once been her sanctuary now felt exposed, vulnerable. As she stood there, the weight of everything that had happened, and everything that could have happened, pressed down on her. Jessica knew that the physical scars would heal with time, but the other scars, the ones that ran deeper, would take much longer to fade. With a deep breath, she stepped back into the cabin. There was still work to be done, both here and within herself. The aftermath of that terrible night was far from over, but Jessica was determined to face it head-on. She had survived the bear's attack. She would survive this too. A week had passed since the bear attack, and Jessica Miller found herself sitting across from Wildlife Officer Jake Thompson in his modest office at the local Department of Fish and Game. The walls were adorned with maps of the surrounding wilderness and posters detailing various wildlife species. A stuffed owl perched on a bookshelf, its glass eyes seeming to watch their conversation. Jessica fidgeted in her chair, her fingers absently tracing the outline of the bandages still covering her shoulder. Officer Thompson leaned forward, his weathered face etched with a mix of concern and skepticism. "Ms. Miller," he began, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I've reviewed your initial statement and the police report. I have to say, a bear breaking into a cabin like that is unusual, to say the least." Jessica felt a flicker of frustration. "I understand it's uncommon, Officer Thompson, but I assure you, every word of my account is true." Thompson held up a hand placatingly. "I'm not saying I don't believe you, Ms. Miller. But without any physical evidence of the bear itself, our options for action are limited." "Limited?" Jessica echoed, disbelief coloring her voice. "A grizzly bear broke into my home and attacked me. Isn't that enough to warrant some kind of response?" The wildlife officer sighed, leaning back in his chair. "We've issued a general bear warning for the area, and we've increased patrols. But the truth is, Ms. Miller, bears are part of the ecosystem here. Unless this particular bear shows a consistent pattern of aggressive behavior towards humans, we can't justify more drastic measures." Jessica felt her heart sink. She had hoped for what? A full-scale bear hunt? Relocation of the entire local bear population? Even as the thoughts crossed her mind, she knew how unrealistic they were. "So what am I supposed to do?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "Just go back to my cabin and hope it doesn't happen again?" Officer Thompson's expression softened. "I know this is difficult, Ms. Miller, but there are steps you can take to reduce the risk of another encounter. Proper food storage, bear-proof trash cans, motion-activated lights. I can provide you with some resources on bear safety if you'd like." Jessica nodded numbly, accepting the handful of pamphlets he offered. As she flipped through them, titles like "Living with Bears" and "Bear Safety for Homeowners" jumped out at her. It all seemed so inadequate in the face of what she had experienced. Leaving the wildlife office, Jessica felt a mix of frustration and helplessness washing over her. The bureaucratic response to her traumatic experience seemed to minimize the terror she had endured. As she walked to her car, she pulled out her phone, opening the draft of a blog post she had been working on. Back in her temporary apartment, Jessica sat at her laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard. She had started writing about her experience for a local wildlife blog, hoping to warn others and perhaps find some catharsis in sharing her story. But now doubt crept in. Would people even believe her? Or would they, like Officer Thompson, view her account with skepticism? With a deep breath, Jessica began to type, "I never thought I'd be writing a post like this. As a wildlife photographer, I've always seen myself as a guest in nature's domain, respecting the wild creatures I photograph from a safe distance. But last week, that distance vanished in the most terrifying way imaginable." She poured her heart into the post, describing the attack in vivid detail. The fear that had gripped her and the frustration she now felt at the limited official response. As she wrote, Jessica felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Even if no one believed her, at least she was getting the story out there. After several hours of writing and rewriting, Jessica finally clicked publish. She sat back, emotionally drained but feeling a sense of accomplishment. At least now others in the area might be more cautious, more aware of the potential dangers lurking in the wilderness. The next morning, Jessica awoke to find her inbox flooded with notifications. Her blog post had gone viral overnight, shared across various outdoor and wildlife forums. As she scrolled through the comments, her heart sank. While many expressed sympathy and shared their own bear encounter stories, a vocal minority questioned her account. Sounds far-fetched? Bears don't just break into cabins like that. Are we sure she didn't provoke the bear somehow? Probably exaggerating for attention. Where's the proof? One comment in particular caught her eye. If this really happened, why isn't Fish and Game doing more? Seems like they'd take a man-eating bear more seriously. Jessica felt a surge of anger. She grabbed her phone, fingers flying across the screen as she typed out a response. "I assure you every word of my account is true. I have the scars and a destroyed cabin to prove it. As for Fish and Game, they've issued a warning, but without ongoing aggressive behavior, their hands are tied. That's why I'm sharing my story, to warn others and hopefully prevent this from happening to someone else." As she hit send, Jessica realized her hands were shaking. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She had known there would be skeptics, but the reality of facing them was more difficult than she had anticipated. Throughout the day, Jessica found herself obsessively checking the blog, responding to comments, and defending her story. By evening, she was emotionally exhausted. As she prepared for bed, her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, her photographer friend. "Hey Jess, saw your blog post. Are you okay? Want me to come up there?" Jessica felt a wave of gratitude for her friend's concern. She typed back, "Thanks, Sarah, I'm hanging in there." Just frustrated with the response, both official and online. "But I'll be okay." Sarah's reply came quickly. "People can be jerks, especially online. Don't let them get to you. Your story is important, and it might save someone else from going through what you did. Proud of you for speaking out." Jessica smiled, feeling a little better. Sarah was right. Even if some people didn't believe her, sharing her story might help others be more cautious and prepared. As she settled into bed, Jessica's mind wandered to her cabin. She had been avoiding going back. The memory of that night still too raw, but she knew she couldn't put it off forever. Tomorrow, she decided, she would return. It was time to face her fears and reclaim her space. With that resolution in mind, Jessica closed her eyes, hoping for a night free from the nightmares that had plagued her since the attack. As she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that her ordeal was far from over. The bear might be gone, but its shadow still loomed large in her life. The journey to healing, both her physical wounds and the deeper, unseen scars, was only just beginning. Weeks had passed since the bear attack, but for Jessica Miller, the memory remained as vivid as ever. She stood on the porch of her newly repaired cabin, her eyes scanning the tree line as they had done countless times since that fateful night. The forest, once a source of comfort and inspiration for her photography, now loomed ominously, harboring unseen threats. Jessica took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "It's just a forest," she whispered to herself. "The same forest you've known for years." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. The attack had changed everything, casting a shadow over the wilderness she once loved unconditionally. With a determined set to her jaw, Jessica turned and entered the cabin. The interior had been meticulously restored, erasing almost all signs of the bear's destructive intrusion. Almost, but not quite. Jessica's trained eye could still spot the subtle differences. The slightly mismatched wood where the floorboards had been replaced, the faint outlines where new drywall met old. Her gaze fell on her camera, sitting untouched on the shelf where she had placed it weeks ago. Once it had been an extension of herself, a tool through which she interpreted and captured the beauty of the natural world. Now, it felt like a relic from another life. Jessica's hand hovered over the camera, trembling slightly. With a frustrated sigh, she withdrew, leaving it where it sat. "Not today," she murmured. The thought of venturing into the woods, of potentially coming face to face with another bear, sent a shiver down her spine. A sudden noise outside made her jump, her heart rate spiking. Jessica rushed to the window, scanning the area frantically. It was just a squirrel scampering across the porch railing. She let out a shaky laugh, equal parts relief and self-deprecation. "Get it together, Jess," she chided herself. "You can't jump at every little sound for the rest of your life." But even as she tried to reassure herself, Jessica knew that overcoming her newfound fear wouldn't be easy. The nightmares that had plagued her since the attack were testament to that. Almost every night she found herself back in that terrifying moment, the bear's massive form filling her bedroom doorway, its hot breath on her face, the searing pain as its claws tore into her flesh. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart racing, the phantom pain in her shoulder a cruel reminder of how close she had come to death. Jessica made her way to the kitchen, absently tracing the jagged scars on her shoulder through her shirt. They had healed well, according to her doctor, but they served as a constant physical reminder of her ordeal. As she prepared a cup of tea, her gaze drifted to the new bear-proof trash bins just outside the kitchen window. They were hulking metal containers, far more industrial-looking than her old plastic bins. But they were necessary now, a part of her new reality. The kettle whistled, startling Jessica out of her reverie. As she poured the hot water over her tea bag, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from her editor at the nature magazine she frequently contributed to. "Hey Jess, hope you're doing well. We've got an exciting opportunity for a spread on Alaskan brown bears. Given your experience and local knowledge, you'd be perfect for the job. Let me know if you're interested and we can discuss details. Best, Mark. Jessica stared at the screen, a mix of emotions washing over her. Once, this would have been a dream assignment. Now, the mere thought of intentionally seeking out bears made her stomach churn. Her finger hovered over the reply button. She could do it, couldn't she? Face her fears, reclaim her passion for wildlife photography. But the memory of those terrifying moments in her bedroom flashed through her mind, and she set the phone down without responding. Not yet, she said to herself. I'm just not ready yet. As the day wore on, Jessica found herself restless. The cabin, once her sanctuary, now felt confining. She needed air, needed to prove to herself that she could still enjoy the outdoors. Without paralyzing fear, steeling herself, Jessica stepped out onto the porch. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the clearing. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the crisp pine-scented air. Slowly, cautiously, she made her way down the porch steps. Each crunch of gravel under her feet seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet afternoon. Jessica's eyes darted from tree to tree, her body tense and ready to flee at the slightest sign of danger. She had only gone a few yards when movement at the edge of the clearing caught her eye. Jessica froze, her heart leaping into her throat. There, partially obscured by the underbrush, was a massive grizzly bear. Time seemed to stand still as Jessica locked eyes with the creature. It was impossible to tell if it was the same bear that had attacked her, but in that moment, it didn't matter. All of her fear, all of her trauma, came rushing back in an overwhelming wave. The bear regarded her curiously, showing no signs of aggression. It was probably just passing through, perhaps drawn by the scent of her trash bins. But to Jessica, it might as well have been charging straight for her. Her breaths came in short, panicked gasps. Run. Stay still. Her mind raced through everything. She knew about bear encounters, but panic clouded her thoughts. Hey! She finally managed to shout, her voice cracking. Get out of here! To her immense relief, the bear seemed startled by her outburst. It turned and lumbered back into the forest, disappearing among the trees as quickly as it had appeared. Jessica remained rooted to the spot, her legs trembling. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, staring at the place where the bear had been, before she finally managed to move. On shaky legs, she retreated to the safety of her cabin, locking the door behind her. As the adrenaline wore off, Jessica sank onto her couch, her body shaking with delayed shock and relief. The encounter, brief as it was, had shaken her to her core, but as her racing thoughts began to slow, she realized something. She had faced her fear. She had seen a bear, and while she was far from comfortable, she had survived the encounter. It was a small step, but an important one. Jessica knew she had a long way to go before she could truly reclaim her life in the wilderness. The lingering fear would not disappear overnight, but for the first time since the attack, she felt a glimmer of hope that she could overcome it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across her living room, Jessica made a decision. She picked up her phone and began to type a reply to her editor. Mark, I appreciate the offer. I'm not sure I'm ready for a full bear assignment yet, but I'd like to discuss the possibility of easing back into wildlife photography. Perhaps we could start with something a little less intense? Let's talk. Jessica. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. It wasn't a full return to form, but it was a start. As she set her phone down, Jessica's gaze fell on her camera. Slowly, hesitantly, she picked it up. The familiar weight in her hands was comforting, a reminder of the passion that had driven her for so long. Jessica knew the road ahead would be challenging. The fear might never fully disappear, but perhaps she could learn to coexist with it, to use it as a tool for caution rather than let it control her. As she looked out at the darkening forest, camera in hand, Jessica felt a spark of her old determination returning. The wilderness had changed for her, but it was still her home, and Jessica Miller was not one to be driven from her home without a fight.